The lawyer's voice stopped mid-sentence when the door opened. Verity Caldwell's hand froze on the edge of the mahogany desk, every muscle in her body going rigid as Everett Rawlins stepped into the cramped office. Dust motes swirled in the afternoon light, slanting through the window. And for one suspended heartbeat, Fox Crossing's respectable innkeeper and the town's most notorious reformed gambler stared at each other across 6 feet of floorboards and 8 years of wreckage. Everett's hat came off slowly, revealing dark blonde hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of winter sky. He wore a brown duster over a black vest, gun belt riding low on his hips, and he looked every inch the dangerous man he'd been the night her father lost everything at his table. The lawyer, a nervous man named Hutchins, cleared his throat twice before finding his voice again. "Your uncles will name you both as equal inheritors of Broken Ranch," he said, shuffling papers with shaking hands. "The cattle, the land, the debt to First Bank of Fox Crossing. Everything split down the middle." Verity found her voice, though it came out sharper than glass. "No, absolutely not. My uncle wouldn't tie me to him. Not after what he did to my family." Everett's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "I didn't force your father to bet what he couldn't afford to lose, Miss Caldwell. And I paid for it in ways you don't know about." "You paid nothing," she shot back, standing so fast her chair scraped wood. "My father hanged himself in our barn 3 months later. My mother died of grief the year after. I've spent 8 years rebuilding a name you helped destroy, and now I'm supposed to partner with you on a failing ranch?" "The will is binding," Hutchins said quietly, pushing a document across the desk. "Unless one of you buys out the other, which, given the current debt situation, seems unlikely." Verity snatched up the paper, scanning numbers that made her stomach drop. $2,200 owed to the bank, due in full by October 1st. That was 6 weeks away. The inn barely kept her fed and housed. She had maybe $300 in careful savings, and every cent of that had been earned on her knees, scrubbing floors, or standing over a hot stove until midnight. "What's the ranch worth if we sell?" Everett asked, his voice level. Hutchins winced. "In current condition, with the debt attached? Maybe $1,500. You'd walk away owing $700 between you." "So we're trapped," Verity said flatly. "Together." Everett turned those cold eyes on her, and something flickered in them that might have been regret, or anger, or something more complicated. "Your Uncle Josiah took me in when this whole town wanted me run out on a rail. He gave me work, a place to sleep, taught me cattle and land and honest labor. I owed him. This inheritance is his way of making sure his legacy doesn't die with him. So yes, we're trapped. But I'm not your enemy, Verity. Not anymore." She wanted to spit at him, wanted to throw the will in his face and walk out. But the numbers were merciless, and beneath her fury lived a harder truth. The inn belonged to the widow who'd taken pity on her years ago. Verity managed it, but she owned nothing. Broken Ranch, failing or not, was the first piece of property that would ever have her name on it. If she walked away, she'd be scrubbing floors until her hands bled and her back broke. "What's on the ranch now?" she asked Hutchins, hating the surrender in her own voice. 200 head of cattle, the man said. Grazing rights on the North Range. A house, barn, bunkhouse. Your uncle hired a cook and 3 hands before he passed. But they're only paid through this week. If you don't make payroll, they'll walk. And the debt? Everett pressed. Comes due October 1st, as stated. If you default, the bank forecloses, and you lose everything. Verity met Everett's gaze across the desk, and the air between them felt heavy enough to choke on. Can we drive the cattle to Dodge City? Sell them for enough to clear the debt and split what's left? Hutchins hesitated. The northern trail through the mountains would get you there in 4 weeks if the weather holds. But it's dangerous this time of year. Early storms, bandits working the passes, and you'd need experienced drovers. I can handle cattle, Everett said quietly. I've done 3 drives with Josiah. Verity's hands curled into fists at her sides. I can't leave the inn for a month. Mrs. Brennan depends on me. Then we hire a trail boss, and I go alone, Everett said. You stay here and hope I don't run off with the herd. She laughed, bitter and sharp. Trust you with $2,200 in cattle? I'd rather burn the ranch myself. His face went hard as stone. Then I guess you're learning to ride, Miss Caldwell. Because I'm not losing Josiah's legacy to your pride. 3 hours later, Verity stood in the yard of Broken Ranch, with a carpet bag at her feet and fury like a living thing in her chest. The house was a 2-story structure that had once been painted white, but now showed bare wood through peeling layers. The barn leaned slightly to the east, and the bunkhouse looked like a strong wind might flatten it. Cattle dotted the north pasture, rust-red shapes against golden grass, and beyond them rose the mountains that would try to kill them in 4 weeks. Everett emerged from the barn leading 2 horses, both saddled. This is Ash, he said, nodding to the gray mare. She's steady. Won't bolt on you. I don't know how to ride, Verity said through clenched teeth. Then you're learning today. We leave at first light tomorrow. The hands want to meet their new bosses before they decide whether to stay. She wanted to argue, but exhaustion and shock had her by the throat. Instead, she took the reins he offered, felt the warm leather against her palm, and let him show her how to put her foot in the stirrup and swing up. The world lurched sideways as the horse shifted, and her hands grabbed the saddle horn hard enough to hurt. Relax, Everett said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Ash can feel your fear. Breathe steady and sit deep. Verity forced air into her lungs, forced her spine straight, and the mare settled beneath her. Everett swung onto his own horse, a rangy chestnut gelding, with the ease of a man who'd been born in the saddle. He clicked his tongue and moved forward, and Ash followed without being asked. They rode a wide loop around the ranch, Everett pointing out property lines and water sources, and the trail that led up into the mountains. The sun dropped toward the western peaks, painting everything in shades of copper and shadow. And despite her anger, Verity felt something shift inside her. The air smelled like sage and dust and distance. The land rolled away in every direction, bigger than anything she'd known in 8 years of keeping her head down and her hands busy in fox crossing. When they returned to the yard, 3 men waited by the bunkhouse. Everett dismounted and helped Verity down, his hands steady on her waist for one brief moment before he stepped back. She hated that her pulse kicked at the contact, hated that some traitorous part of her noticed the way his duster hung on his shoulders, and the way his eyes tracked her movements like he was memorizing her. This is Verity Caldwell, Everett said to the men. Josiah's niece. We're co-owners now, and we're driving the herd to Dodge to clear the debt. The oldest of the 3, a grizzled man with a salt and pepper beard, spat tobacco juice into the dust. Tom Grady, he said. I was Josiah's foreman for 6 years. You planning to run this drive yourself, Rawlins? We are, Everett said evenly. You willing to stay on? Grady looked Verity up and down with a frankness that made her bristle. She ever been on a drive before? No, Verity said, lifting her chin. But I've run an inn for 8 years. I know hard work, long hours, and how to manage men who think women belong in kitchens. Grady's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Fair enough. The other two are Cole and Jimmy. Cole's good with a rope. Jimmy's young, but he learns fast. Our cook, Bess, makes biscuits that'll keep you alive when the trail wants you dead. We'll stay on if the pay's guaranteed once we sell. It is, Everett said. I'm staking my share on it. Verity nodded, swallowing her doubts. Then, we have a deal. The men dispersed to evening chores, and Everett led her to the house. Inside, dust lay thick on furniture that had seen better decades, but the bones were solid. A large kitchen dominated the back. A sitting room and office filled the front, and narrow stairs climbed to 3 bedrooms above. Everett set her bag down at the base of the stairs. You take the big room at the front, he said. I'll take the small one in back. We leave before dawn. Get what rest you can. She caught his arm as he turned away, her fingers closing on the worn fabric of his sleeve. Why did my uncle leave you half? The truth. Everett looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face, and the rawness in his expression almost made her let go. Because the night your father died, I went looking for him. I found him in that barn, Verity. I cut him down and I tried to bring him back, but I was too late. Josiah found me there, covered in your father's blood, and he didn't turn me in when half the town would have said I drove him to it. He gave me a chance to be something other than the man who ruined Daniel Caldwell. This ranch is his way of making sure I finish what he started. Verity's hand fell away. You were there? You never told anyone? I told Josiah. He said it wasn't my story to tell. And you were 17, Verity. Drowning in grief. What good would it have done? She turned away, her throat tight, and climbed the stairs without another word. In the big bedroom, she sank onto the edge of a narrow bed and let the tears come, silent and bitter. For 8 years, she'd hated Everett Rawlins with a purity that kept her spine straight and her purpose clear. Now that hate had a crack in it, and she didn't know what would fill the space. Sleep came in shallow fits. Before dawn, she woke to the sound of voices in the yard and the lowing of cattle being gathered. She dressed in the dark, braided her hair with shaking hands, and went downstairs to find Bess, the cook, a square-built woman in her 50s, frying bacon over a wood stove that filled the kitchen with smoke and heat. You'll want a heavier skirt and a coat, Bess said without preamble. Mountains get cold before you expect. Tie that braid up under a hat if you've got one. Dust and wind will ruin it otherwise. Verity nodded, accepting a plate of bacon and biscuits that tasted better than anything she'd eaten in years. Everett came in as she finished, his face shadowed with stubble and exhaustion. He poured coffee from the pot on the stove, drank it black and scalding, and met her eyes across the kitchen. You ready? No, she said. But I'm coming anyway. By the time the sun broke over the eastern plains, they were moving. 200 head of cattle, 4 drovers, 1 cook in a supply wagon, and 2 people who barely trusted each other, heading north into country that didn't forgive mistakes. Verity rode beside Everett at the front of the herd, her thighs already aching from the saddle. Her hands blistered inside borrowed gloves. The first day passed in a blur of dust and noise, and the constant pressure of keeping the cattle moving without letting them scatter. Grady rode flank, his voice sharp and clear when a steer tried to bolt. Cole worked the drag, pushing stragglers forward. Jimmy ranged wide, watching for hazards. Bess drove the wagon with the steady competence of someone who'd done this 100 times. By the time they made camp that night beside a shallow creek, Verity could barely stand. Everett helped her down from the saddle, his hands impersonal but steady, and she hated how grateful she felt. Bess handed her a tin plate of stew and a hunk of bread, and she ate sitting on the ground because her legs wouldn't hold her. Everett sat nearby, his back against a wagon wheel, cleaning his revolver with a scrap of cloth. "You did well today," he said quietly. "Most people fall off 3 or 4 times their first day." "I won't give you the satisfaction," she said, too tired for venom. His mouth curved, almost a smile. "Stubbornness might keep you alive out here." She looked at him through the firelight, seeing the weariness in his face and the way his hands moved over the gun with automatic precision. "Why did you stay in Fox Crossing after my father died? Everyone hated you. You could have gone anywhere." "I deserved the hate," he said simply. "And running doesn't fix anything. I figured if I stayed, worked hard, kept my head down, maybe I could prove I was more than one bad night. Josiah gave me that chance. Your uncle was a better man than I'll ever be." "You're trying to be," she said, surprising herself. Everett looked up, something raw flickering in his eyes. "Is that enough?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. They sat in silence as the fire burned low, and the stars came out in a sky so big it made her feel like a speck of dust on an endless plain. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, high and lonesome, and the cattle shifted restlessly. The second day brought rain, cold and relentless, turning the trail into mud that sucked at the horses' hooves and made every mile a battle. Verity's clothes soaked through, her braid dripped down her back, and the world narrowed to the horse beneath her and the endless line of cattle pressing forward. Everett rode beside her, his duster dark with water, his face set in grim concentration. When they camped that night, Bess built a fire under a canvas lean-to and made coffee strong enough to strip paint. Verity huddled close to the flames, shivering so hard her teeth rattled. Everett draped a dry blanket over her shoulders without a word, and she pulled it tight, too cold to refuse. "We're making good time," Grady said, squatting by the fire. "If the weather clears, we'll be through the first pass in 3 days." "What's the worst that can happen up there?" Verity asked. Grady and Everett exchanged a look. "Rock slides," Everett said. "Flash floods in the narrow canyons. Bandits who know the passes and set ambushes. Mountain lions if we're unlucky. And storms that come out of nowhere and freeze you solid." Verity laughed, harsh and tired. "And here I thought the worst part would be spending a month with you." Everett's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went distant. "If we make it through, you'll never have to see me again. We'll sell the herd, split the money, and you can go back to your inn. That's the deal." She didn't answer, because she didn't know why that idea sat in her chest like a stone. On the 4th day, the sun returned, fierce and hot, baking the mud into cracked earth. They climbed into the foothills, the trail narrowing as pine trees closed in on both sides. The cattle bunched together, nervous in the confined space, and Grady rode ahead to scout the path. He came back an hour later, his face tight, There's a tree down across the trail about a mile up. Big pine. We'll need to clear it, or find another way around. How long to clear it? Everett asked. Half a day if we're lucky. Maybe more. Can we go around? Grady shook his head. The slopes are too steep. We'd lose cattle. Then we clear it, Everett said. They left Cole and Jimmy with the herd and rode ahead with axes from the supply wagon. The fallen pine was massive, its trunk thick as a man's waist, lying across the trail like a barricade. Verity dismounted and picked up one of the axes, testing its weight. You ever swung an axe? Everett asked. I've chopped firewood for 8 years, she said. I'll manage. They worked in shifts, the axes biting into wood with rhythmic thunks that echoed off the canyon walls. Sweat soaked through Verity's blouse. Her shoulders burned, and her hands blistered inside the gloves. But she kept swinging. Everett worked beside her, his duster discarded, his shirt clinging to his back. She tried not to notice the way his muscles moved under the fabric, tried not to think about how he looked like something carved out of the land itself, hard and enduring. By the time they cut through, the sun hung low and red in the west. Grady and the others brought the herd forward, pushing the cattle through the gap in single file. Verity leaned against a tree, her whole body shaking with fatigue, and watched Everett coil rope with hands that had to be as raw as hers. You're stronger than you look, he said, not unkindly. You're less of a bastard than I thought, she said back. He almost smiled. High praise from you. That night, they camped in a meadow ringed by pines, the air sharp with the smell of resin and wood smoke. Bess made stew with the last of the potatoes, and Verity ate until her stomach ached. Afterward, she sat by the fire, trying to mend a torn seam in her skirt by flickering light. Everett settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Let me see your hands, he said. She started to refuse, but he'd already taken her wrist, turning her palm up to the firelight. The blisters were angry and red, some of them weeping. He pulled a small tin from his pocket, opened it to reveal a pale salve, and began smoothing it over the worst of the damage with surprising gentleness. Josiah taught me to make this, he said quietly. Beeswax and yarrow. It'll help them heal faster. Verity watched his face as he worked, the firelight carving shadows under his cheekbones and turning his eyes to dark gold. Why are you being kind to me? Because you're trying, he said. Because you didn't have to come on this drive, but you did. And because I'm tired of you hating me, Verity. I can't fix what I did to your family. But maybe I can help keep you alive long enough to hate me from a distance. I don't hate you as much as I did 4 days ago, she admitted. His hand stilled on hers. That's progress. She pulled away, her pulse unsteady, and focused on her sewing. But the space between them felt different now, charged with something that wasn't quite trust, but wasn't hate either. On the 6th day, they entered the high pass, a narrow defile between sheer rock walls that blotted out the sky. The air turned cold, smelling of stone and snow, and the cattle balked at the shadows. It took hours to push them through, the drovers shouting themselves hoarse, and Verity's nerves stretched tighter with every step. They were halfway through when the first shot cracked off the canyon wall. Everett moved before the echo faded, grabbing Verity's reins and yanking her horse close to the rock face. Get down, he barked, and she obeyed, sliding from the saddle as more shots rang out, the reports deafening in the confined space. Grady returned fire from somewhere ahead, his rifle sharp and deliberate. Cole and Jimmy scattered the cattle to keep them from stampeding. Everett pulled his revolver and fired twice toward the rim of the canyon, then dragged Verity behind a boulder. "How many?" she gasped. "3? Maybe 4, he said, reloading with quick hands. "They want the cattle." "Over my dead body," she said, and meant it. He looked at her, something fierce and approving flashing in his eyes. "Stay here. I'm going up." Before she could protest, he was moving, climbing the steep slope with the agility of a mountain cat. She watched him disappear into the rocks, her heart hammering, and then turned her attention to the herd. The cattle were milling in panic, and if they bolted, they'd trample each other in the narrow pass. She ran to the nearest steer, waving her arms and shouting until it turned. Another shot cracked overhead, and rock chips stung her face, but she didn't stop. She pushed the cattle back, one at a time, using her body and her voice in sheer stubborn will. Above, Everett's gun barked twice, then silence. A moment later, a man screamed, high and sharp, and the sound cut off abruptly. No more shots came. Everett appeared at the top of the slope, his face grim, and made his way back down. "They're gone," he said. "2 ran. 1 won't be running anywhere again." "Did you kill him?" Verity asked. His jaw tightened. "He didn't give me a choice." She nodded, her hands shaking now that the danger had passed. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Are you?" She looked down at herself, surprised to find blood on her sleeve where a rock chip had sliced through. "It's nothing." Everett took her arm, his touch careful, and examined the cut. "It's not nothing. Bess has bandages in the wagon. Come on." That night, they camped just beyond the pass, and Bess poured whiskey over Verity's wound before bandaging it tight. Verity bit down on a leather strap and didn't make a sound, though tears leaked from the corners of her eyes. Everett sat beside her through it, his hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. When it was done, Bess looked at them both with something like approval. "You two might actually make it to Dodge. If the weather holds," Grady said from across the fire. "But there's a storm building in the north. I can smell it." "How long do we have?" Everett asked. "Day, maybe 2. We need to move fast." They drove hard the next day, pushing the cattle until even the experienced steers stumbled with exhaustion. The sky turned the color of old bruises, heavy and low, and the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and electricity. By evening, the first drops fell, fat and cold, and by nightfall, the storm hit in earnest. Lightning split the sky, turning the world white and black in strobing flashes. Thunder rolled like cannon fire. The cattle spooked and ran, and suddenly they were in the middle of a stampede. 200 panicked animals charging through the darkness. Verity clung to Ash's mane as the mare ran with the herd, her heart in her throat, the world reduced to noise and motion and terror. She saw Everett ahead, fighting to turn the leaders, his horse plunging and rearing. She kicked Ash forward, leaning low over the mare's neck, and somehow reached the front of the stampede. Together they turned the herd, bending it back on itself until the cattle ran in a wide circle and finally slowed, blowing and trembling. The rain pounded down, soaking everything, turning the ground to slick mud. Verity slid from the saddle and fell to her knees, gasping for air. Everett was beside her in an instant, pulling her up, his hands gripping her arms. Are you hurt? No, she managed. You? I'm fine. We need to get to shelter. This storm's not done. They gathered the herd in a hollow between two hills and built a fire under an overhang of rock that barely kept the rain off. The cattle huddled together, their sides heaving. The drovers took turns standing watch, and Verity collapsed beside the fire, shaking with cold and adrenaline. Everett sat down beside her and pulled her against his side, sharing his body heat. She was too tired to protest, too cold to care about pride. His arm came around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart through the wet fabric of his shirt. You saved the herd tonight, he said quietly. That turn you made, most experienced drovers couldn't have pulled it off. I didn't think, she said. I just moved. That's what courage is, he said. Moving when you're terrified. She looked up at him, at the lines of exhaustion on his face and the rain dripping from his hair, and something inside her shifted all the way over. I don't hate you anymore, she said. I think I stopped days ago. His hand came up, his thumb brushing water from her cheek. I don't deserve that. Maybe not, she said. But I'm tired of carrying it. And you've kept me alive out here, Everett. That has to count for something. He looked like he wanted to say more, but Grady called out from the darkness, asking about the herd count, and the moment broke. Verity pulled away, her face hot despite the cold, and busied herself helping Bess prepare a meal from the dwindling supplies. But that night, when she finally lay down on her bedroll, she couldn't stop thinking about the warmth of Everett's arm around her, and the way his voice had gone soft when he said her name. The storm cleared by morning, leaving the world scrubbed clean and painfully bright. They moved on, climbing higher into the mountains, and the days blurred together in a rhythm of motion and exhaustion. Verity's body hardened to the work. Her hands toughened. Her seat in the saddle grew confident. She learned to read the cattle, to anticipate trouble, to work in silent partnership with Everett, as they guided the herd through narrow passes and across swift-running creeks. On the 10th day, they reached a high valley where wildflowers bloomed in riotous color, and a clear stream tumbled over smooth stones. They made camp early, and Bess declared a rest day to let the cattle graze and the humans recover. Verity washed in the creek, scrubbing trail dust from her skin and hair, and then sat on the bank, braiding her wet hair in the sun. Everett appeared upstream, leading his horse to drink, and when he saw her, he stopped. I didn't mean to intrude, he said. You're not, she said. There's room. He let the horse drink and then sat a few feet away, his boots dangling over the water. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the creek and the wind in the pines, and Verity felt something rare and fragile settle over her. Peace, maybe. Or the beginning of it. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Everett nodded. Why did you become a gambler? Before. When you were young. He was quiet for a long time, his gaze on the water. My father drank himself to death when I was 12. My mother remarried a man who liked his fists more than his family. I left when I was 15, worked cattle drives and ranch jobs. But I was good with cards, better than I was with a rope. Gambling was easy money, and I told myself it didn't matter who I took it from. I was wrong. Your father wasn't the first man I ruined, but he was the one who made me see what I'd become. I've spent 8 years thinking you were a monster, Verity said. But you're just a man who made mistakes. Aren't we all? He said quietly. She reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. His skin was warm and rough, and he held on like she might disappear if he let go. "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for asking," he said. They sat like that until Bess called them to supper, and when they walked back to camp together, Verity didn't let go of his hand. That night, as the fire burned low and the others drifted to sleep, Everett walked Verity to her bedroll. He stopped close enough that she could feel the heat of him, and his hand came up to cup her cheek. "If we make it to Dodge," he said, "and we sell the herd, and we go our separate ways, I want you to know that these days with you have been the best of my life. Not because of the cattle or the ranch, but because you looked at me like I might be worth something. That's more than I deserve, Verity. More than I thought I'd ever get." She turned her face into his palm. "What if I don't want to go our separate ways?" His breath caught. "Don't say that, unless you mean it." "I mean it," she said. "I don't know what happens after Dodge. But I know I don't want to lose you, Everett. Not now." He bent his head and kissed her, slow and careful, like she was something precious that might break. She kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, and the world narrowed to the taste of him and the solid warmth of his body against hers. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." "Together," she agreed. On the 14th day, they crested the final pass and saw the plains stretching away to the north, golden and endless under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Dodge City was 5 days away. Maybe less if they pushed hard. The herd sensed it too, moving with renewed energy, and the drovers whooped and hollered in celebration. But that night, as they made camp in a shallow draw, Grady came to Everett with his face tight. "We've got a problem. 3 of the steers are missing." "I did a count twice." "Missing how?" Everett asked, instantly alert. "Cut out and driven off," Grady said. "I found tracks leading west. 2 riders. Maybe 3. "Rustlers," Verity said, cold spreading through her chest. Everett's jaw hardened. "How long ago?" "Can't be more than an hour. We can track them if we leave now." "I'm coming," Verity said. Everett started to argue, then stopped. "Bring your rifle." They rode out in the last light of day, following tracks that led into rougher country, where the ground turned rocky and the trail became harder to read. Grady led, his eyes on the dirt, and Everett rode beside Verity, his hand never far from his gun. They found the rustlers in a box canyon, 3 men trying to rebrand the stolen steers with a running iron. Everett and Grady flanked them from the high ground, while Verity stayed back with the horses, her rifle ready. "Those are our cattle," Everett called down. "Leave them and ride out, and we'll call it done." The rustlers spun, guns drawn, and shots cracked through the canyon. Verity saw Grady go down, saw Everett return fire, methodical and deadly. She raised her rifle and fired once, the recoil slamming into her shoulder, and one of the rustlers dropped. The other 2 ran, abandoning the cattle and their fallen partner. Everett climbed down to Grady, who was bleeding from a shoulder wound but alive. Verity tied off the cattle and then helped load Grady onto his horse. "We need to get him back to Bess," she said. Everett nodded, his face grim. "You did good, Verity. That shot saved us." "I've never shot a man before," she said, her voice shaking. He pulled her close, his arms strong around her. "You did what you had to. No more, no less." They rode back to camp in darkness, and Bess patched Grady up with whiskey and needle and thread while he cursed in 3 languages. By morning, he was pale but stubborn, refusing to stay behind. "I'm seeing this through," he said. Josiah would have wanted it. They moved on, the herd intact, and 5 days later, Dodge City rose out of the plains like a promise. The cattle pens stretched for acres, the smell of livestock and commerce thick in the air. Everett negotiated with the buyers while Verity watched, and when the final price came in at $3,100, she felt something tight in her chest finally loosen. They paid off the hands, settled the debt to the bank by wire, and split what remained. $1,500 in clean bills, $750 each. It was more money than Verity had ever held at once, and it felt like freedom in her hands. That night, they took a room at a boarding house, and Everett built a fire while Verity washed trail dust from her skin and changed into a dress she'd carried all the way from Fox Crossing. When she came downstairs, he looked at her like she was something miraculous. "You look beautiful," he said. "You look like you might survive," she said, taking in his shaved jaw and clean shirt. They ate supper at a restaurant with white tablecloths and food that didn't taste like trail dust, and afterward, they walked the streets of Dodge City under a sky full of stars. Everett took her hand, and she let him. And when they stopped in the shadow of a building, he pulled her close. "I want to ask you something," he said. "But I need you to know you can say no." "Ask," she said. "Come back to Fox Crossing with me. Help me rebuild the ranch. Not as partners, Verity. As my wife." She stared at him, her heart pounding. "Everett, we've known each other for 3 weeks. Most of that time, I hated you. And now?" he asked. "Now I think I might love you," she said. "But that doesn't mean marriage is the answer." His hands tightened on hers. "I know it's fast. I know we've got history that's ugly and complicated. But I also know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You're strong and brave and stubborn as hell. And you make me want to be a better man. I don't have much to offer, except a failing ranch and a name that's still got dirt on it. But if you'll have me, Verity, I swear I'll spend the rest of my life proving you didn't make a mistake." "What about the inn?" she asked. "Mrs. Brennan needs me. We'll help her find someone new," he said. "Or you can go back for a while, and I'll wait. I'm not going anywhere." Verity looked at him, at the raw hope in his eyes, and the way he held her hands like they were the only thing keeping him anchored. She thought about the ranch, about the land rolling away under a sky big enough to swallow you whole. She thought about the way he'd kept her alive through storms and stampedes and ambushes. She thought about the way his voice went soft when he said her name. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you, Everett Rawlins. But if you ever lie to me, or hurt me, or make me regret this, I will leave and take half the ranch with me." He laughed, bright and disbelieving, and kissed her until she forgot where she ended and he began. "Deal," he said against her mouth. They married the next morning in a small church on the edge of town, with Grady and Bess as witnesses, and a preacher who smelled like whiskey and salvation. Verity wore her traveling dress and held a handful of wildflowers Everett had picked at dawn. He wore his best shirt and a tie that kept trying to strangle him. And when he said his vows, his voice broke on her name. Afterward, they sent a wire to Fox Crossing announcing the sale and the marriage. and Verity wrote a long letter to Mrs. Brennan, promising to return for a month to help train her replacement. Then, they bought supplies and 2 good horses and started the long ride back to Broken Ranch. The journey took 2 weeks, and they traveled slow, stopping to camp under the stars and make love in their blankets while the horses cropped grass nearby. Everett taught her to shoot with more precision, and she taught him to cook something other than beans and bacon. They talked about the ranch, about what they'd plant and build and fix, and about the children they might have someday. When they finally rode into the yard of Broken Ranch, the house looked smaller than Verity remembered. But the land still stretched away in every direction, golden and wild and theirs. Everett swung down and lifted her from the saddle, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, laughing. "Welcome home, Mrs. Rawlins," he said. "Home," she repeated, testing the word. It felt right. They spent the fall repairing the ranch, working side by side to mend fences, and patch the barn roof, and paint the house a clean, hopeful white. Grady came back to work as foreman, and they hired 2 more hands to help with the spring cattle drive. Bess stayed on as cook, her biscuits still the best thing Verity had ever tasted. On a morning in late October, Verity woke to find frost on the windows, and Everett already dressed, standing at the bedroom window looking out at the land. She joined him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and leaned against his side. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," he said. "That I don't deserve you, but I'm keeping you anyway." She smiled and took his hand, pressing it to her belly where a tiny life had just begun to grow. "You deserve me, Everett. And you're about to deserve someone else too." He looked down at her, his eyes wide, and then he was kissing her, laughing and crying at the same time. "A baby?" "A baby," she confirmed. He dropped to his knees and pressed his face to her stomach, his arms around her hips, and she ran her fingers through his hair and felt something full and complete settle into her bones. This was home, this man, this land, this life they were building together from the wreckage of their pasts. Outside, the sun rose over the mountains, painting the world in shades of gold and promise. The cattle lowed in the distance. The wind carried the smell of pine and sage. And inside the little white house on Broken Ranch, 2 people who had every reason to hate each other chose love instead. The winter passed in a blur of hard work and quiet domesticity. Verity's body changed slowly, her belly rounding, and Everett hovered over her like she might break. She tolerated it with amused patience, and when he tried to stop her from chopping wood or carrying water, she reminded him that she'd survived a cattle drive and a stampede, and she could certainly handle ranch chores while pregnant. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, and Everett read aloud from the few books they owned, his voice low and soothing. Verity sewed baby clothes from scraps of fabric, her needle flashing in the firelight, and sometimes she'd look up to find him watching her with an expression so tender it made her throat tight. On a night in late February, when the snow lay thick on the ground and the stars burned cold and bright, Verity's labor began. Bess came and took charge, sending Everett to boil water and pace the kitchen while Verity labored upstairs. The hours blurred together in pain and effort, and just before dawn, a thin wail cut through the house. Everett took the stairs 3 at a time and burst into the bedroom to find Bess wrapping a tiny red-faced infant in a clean blanket. "It's a girl," Bess said, grinning. "Strong lungs, all her fingers and toes. She's perfect." Verity lay back against the pillows, exhausted and radiant, and held out her arms. Everett placed the baby in them with shaking hands, and Verity looked down at the tiny face and felt her heart crack open all over again. "What should we name her?" Everett asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Hope," Verity said. "Because that's what she is." Everett kissed Verity's forehead, then the baby's, and his voice broke when he spoke. "Hope Rawlins. It's perfect." They sat together as the sun rose, the three of them, and Verity thought about the long road that had brought them here. The grief and anger and mistakes, the storms and stampedes and moments when death had felt close enough to touch. But they'd survived. More than that, they'd built something worth keeping. Spring came with a rush of green and the return of the cattle from winter pasture. Grady and the hands worked from dawn to dusk, and Verity managed the household with a baby on her hip, and a competence that made Everett shake his head in wonder. She'd hired a young woman from town to help with the heavy work, and together they kept the ranch running, while Everett focused on expanding the herd and negotiating better grazing rights. In May, they drove 100 head to market in Dodge City, and this time the trip felt like a victory lap instead of a desperate gamble. Verity stayed home with Hope, but she kissed Everett goodbye at the gate and told him to come back safe. He did, 3 weeks later, with money in his saddlebags and a music box for Hope that played a tinkling waltz. Verity met him in the yard, Hope balanced on her hip, and he kissed them both like he'd been gone a year. That night, after Hope was asleep in her cradle, Everett and Verity sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. The air smelled like sage and new grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to the moon. "Do you ever miss the inn?" Everett asked. "Sometimes," Verity admitted. "I miss Mrs. Brennan, and the routine, and the feeling of having everything under control. But this is better. This is mine. Ours." He took her hand. "Any regrets?" "Not one," she said. "You?" "Only that I didn't find you sooner," he said. She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "We found each other when we needed to. That's enough." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from knowing someone all the way through. The ranch stretched around them, solid and real, built from sweat and trust and the stubborn refusal to give up. And as the stars wheeled overhead, Verity thought about the girl she'd been 8 years ago, drowning in grief and rage, and the woman she'd become. Stronger, braver, loved. It had been a long road, but she'd walked it with a man who'd started as her enemy and ended as her home. And that, she thought, was a story worth telling. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. The ranch grew steadily, and with it, their family. A son came 2 years after Hope, sturdy and quiet like his father, and they named him Daniel after Verity's father. Everett held the baby and wept, and Verity knew that her father's ghost had finally been laid to rest. Hope grew into a wild-haired girl who climbed fences and rode horses before she could barely walk. Daniel was gentler, more thoughtful, content to follow his mother around the kitchen and help her with baking. They were loved fiercely and raised with the kind of freedom that only comes from wide-open land, and parents who trust their children to find their own way. The town of Fox Crossing never fully forgave Everett for the past, but they respected him. He was fair in his dealings, generous with those in need, and his cattle brought good prices at market. Slowly, grudgingly, people began to nod when he passed on the street, and invitations to town gatherings started to include his name alongside Verity's. Verity became known as the woman who could doctor a sick cow or deliver a breech calf with the same competence she brought to running a household. She kept the ranch books, negotiated supply contracts, and somehow found time to teach Hope and Daniel their letters and numbers. She was respected, even admired, and if anyone remembered the scandal of her father's death, they kept it to themselves. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Everett took Verity back to the meadow where they'd rested during that first cattle drive. They left the children with Bess and rode out in the early morning, the horses moving easy through familiar country. When they reached the meadow, wildflowers bloomed in riotous color, just as they had 5 years before, and the creek tumbled over smooth stones with the same endless music. They spread a blanket and ate the lunch Bess had packed, and then Everett pulled Verity into his arms and kissed her slow and thorough, like they had all the time in the world. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" he asked. "You were so angry at me, so determined not to need anyone." "I remember," she said. "I also remember thinking you were impossible and dangerous and far too good-looking for my peace of mind." He laughed. "You never said that." "I thought it, though," she said. "Even when I hated you, I noticed." "Good," he said. "Because I noticed you, too. I noticed how strong you were, how you never quit, how you looked at the world like you were daring it to knock you down. I fell in love with you somewhere between the stampede and the ambush, and I've been falling ever since." She kissed him again, tasting sunlight and grass and the sweetness of a life well lived. "I love you, Everett Rawlins. I love this life we've built. I love that our children will grow up, knowing what it means to work hard and stand by the people you love. I love that we took something broken and made it whole. We did that together," he said. "And we're not done yet." They rode back to the ranch as the sun began its descent, painting the world in shades of amber and rose. The children ran to meet them in the yard, Hope shouting about a nest of kittens she'd found in the barn, and Daniel shyly offering a handful of wildflowers he'd picked for his mother. Everett lifted both children into his arms, one on each hip, and carried them inside while they chattered about their day. Verity followed, her heart full, and paused in the doorway to look back at the land. The mountains rose sharp against the sky, the cattle grazed in the distance, and the setting sun turned everything to gold. This was her home. Not the house, though she loved it. Not the land, though it was beautiful. Home was the man who'd learned to be gentle with her and fierce for her. Home was the children who carried pieces of both of them in their faces and their laughter. Home was the life they'd fought for and earned and built together from the ashes of their pasts. She turned and went inside, closing the door behind her, and the sound of her family's voices wrapped around her like a blanket. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, and the stars began their slow wheel across the sky. And inside the little white house on Broken Ranch, love endured. 10 years after that first cattle drive, Verity stood in the yard of Broken Ranch and watched her daughter ride out with Grady to check the north pasture. Hope was 16 now, tall and confident in the saddle, her braids swinging down her back just like her mother's. Daniel, 14 and thoughtful, worked in the barn with his father, their voices a low murmur as they repaired tack. The ranch had prospered beyond anything Verity had dared to hope for that first desperate year. They ran 400 head of cattle now, had rebuilt the bunkhouse and added a second barn, and employed 6 hands year-round. The debt to the bank was a distant memory, and their name carried weight in Fox Crossing and beyond. But prosperity had not come easy. There had been droughts that shriveled the grass and forced them to sell cattle at a loss. There had been hard winters when they'd lost stock to cold and wolves. There had been years when the market crashed, and they'd gone without new clothes or luxuries to keep the ranch afloat. But through it all, Everett and Verity had stood together, partners in every sense of the word. Verity walked to the fence and leaned against it, watching the sun climb the eastern sky. Behind her, the house stood white and solid, smoke rising from the kitchen chimney where Bess was making breakfast. The land rolled away in every direction, familiar as her own heartbeat, and she thought about the girl she'd been at 26, standing in a lawyer's office with hate in her heart and fear in her belly. That girl had been so certain she knew what she wanted: independence, respect, a life built on her own terms with no man to complicate it. And she'd gotten all of that. But she'd also gotten something she hadn't known to ask for: love, partnership, a family that filled the empty places inside her and made her stronger than she'd ever been alone. Everett came up behind her, his arms sliding around her waist, and she leaned back against him with a sigh of contentment. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How far we've come," she said. "How different everything is from what I thought I wanted." "Are you sorry?" he asked, and she heard the faint thread of uncertainty in his voice even after all these years. She turned in his arms to face him. "Never. Not once. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Everett Rawlins. Even when I hated you, you were changing my life. And now I can't imagine it without you." He kissed her, slow and sweet, and when he pulled back, his eyes were bright. "I love you, Verity. Every day, I love you more." She smiled and took his hand. "Come on. Bess will have breakfast ready, and I want to hear what Daniel thinks about that colt we're breaking." They walked back to the house together, their fingers intertwined, and as they crossed the threshold, Verity looked back one more time at the land that had tested them and shaped them and given them everything that mattered. This was the story she would tell her grandchildren someday. Not just the cattle drive, or the storms, or the dangers they'd faced, but the harder, truer story of two people who'd had every reason to hate each other and chose love instead. Who'd taken something broken and made it whole. Who'd learned that the strongest things are built not in easy times, but in the fire. And as the sun climbed higher and the day opened before them, full of work and laughter and the ordinary miracles of a life well lived, Verity knew with bone-deep certainty that she would not change a single step of the journey that had brought her here. The seasons turned and turned again. Hope married a neighboring rancher's son, a good man who loved the land as much as she did, and they built a house on the eastern section of Broken Ranch. Daniel went to school in Denver for 2 years to study law, then came home and opened a practice in Fox Crossing, defending the small ranchers and settlers who needed someone to speak for them. Everett's hair went gray at the temples, and Verity found silver threads in her own braid. Their hands grew more calloused, their bodies a little slower, but the work never stopped. There were always cattle to tend, fences to mend, decisions to make. And through it all, they worked side by side, their partnership deepened by time and tested by hardship and made unbreakable by choice. On a summer evening, when they were both 50, Everett and Verity sat on the porch as the sun set, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Hope's 2 daughters and Daniel's son, all of them brown from the sun and loud with laughter. Bess had finally retired, moving to town to live with her sister. but the ranch still ran like a clock. Now, under the management of Cole, the young drover who'd stayed on and grown into a fine foreman. Everett reached over and took Verity's hand, his thumb tracing the familiar lines of her palm. "Do you remember that first night on the trail? When you told me you didn't hate me as much as you did 4 days before?" She laughed, the sound warm and rich. "I remember. I was terrified to admit it. I was terrified you'd never say it," he said. "I thought I'd spend the whole drive waiting for you to forgive me. And then we'd part ways and I'd never see you again. Instead, you married me," she said, "and gave me this whole beautiful, messy life. Best decision I ever made," he said. "Second best," she corrected. "The best was when you decided to become someone worth marrying." He smiled, that rare, slow smile that still made her pulse quicken. "I had help with that. A stubborn innkeeper who wouldn't let me give up on myself." The children's laughter floated across the yard, and Verity leaned her head on Everett's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him and the rightness of this moment. They had built something that would last beyond them. The ranch would pass to Hope and Daniel, and their children after them. And the name Rawlins would carry the weight of honor and hard work, instead of scandal and shame. It had taken 2 lifetimes to get here. Her father's life, lost to despair, and Everett's first life, lost to recklessness. But from those ashes, they had built something new. Something strong. Something worth passing on. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Everett pulled Verity closer, and she felt the steady beat of his heart against her side. This, she thought, was what love looked like when you stripped away the romance and the drama. It was sitting together, in the quiet, your hands intertwined, your lives so deeply braided that you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. It was choosing each other every morning and every evening, through drought and plenty, through grief and joy, until the choosing became as natural as breathing. And when the last light faded from the sky and the children were called inside, Everett and Verity rose and walked into the house together. Their steps matched, their shadows merging into one. Years later, on a morning bright with autumn sun, Verity woke to find the bed beside her empty. She rose and dressed, her body stiff from a lifetime of work, and went downstairs to find Everett in the kitchen, making coffee. His hair was white now, his face lying deep, but his eyes still held that same sharp clarity they'd had the day he walked into the lawyer's office and changed her life. "Can't sleep?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "Too much to think about," he said, pouring her a cup. "Hope wants to expand the herd. Daniel's arguing a case in front of the territorial court next month. And I woke up this morning realizing I've been married to you for 30 years. 31 in December," she corrected. 31, he repeated, shaking his head. "How did we get here?" "One day at a time," she said. "One choice after another." He set down his cup and took both her hands in his. "I want you to know something. Every choice I made after that night in your father's barn, I made trying to be worthy of you. I don't know if I ever got there. But I tried, Verity. Every day, I tried." She cupped his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his skin and the warmth of him. "You got there," she said fiercely. "You got there the day you helped me onto that horse and taught me to ride. You got there when you kept me alive through the stampede. You got there when you asked me to marry you, knowing I might say no. You've been worthy every single day since. He pulled her close, and they stood together in the quiet kitchen as the sun climbed higher and the ranch woke around them. Outside, the cattle lowed, the horses whickered in the barn, and somewhere a rooster crowed. The sounds of home, the sounds of a life well lived. When they finally pulled apart, Everett smiled down at her. "Ready for another day?" "Always," she said. And they walked out into the morning together, partners still, bound by love and choice, and the unbreakable thread of a story that had started in anger